A shattered ship returned from the fog carrying only one survivor and a blood-stained letter. Two Viking sisters discovered that some promises are more dangerous than any storm. The man they pulled from the wreckage wore an iron slave collar and a symbol that should have been buried with the past. One sister had waited years for him to return. The other had prayed he never would, because the love they both felt for the same man was built on a foundation of lies, and the truth waiting beneath would destroy everything they thought they knew about loyalty, sacrifice, and the price of forbidden desire. In a world where jealousy runs deeper than blood and betrayal wears the mask of protection, these sisters will be forced to confront a devastating question. When love becomes a weapon, can forgiveness ever be anything more than another beautiful lie? What began as a promise carved in oak will end in a confession that shatters souls, and the sea isn't finished returning secrets yet. But here's what no one expected. The man they're fighting over has been lying since the moment he opened his eyes, and his reason for coming back will break them both in ways they never imagined possible. The sea roared like a wounded beast when the fog tore open, revealing a mutilated ship dragged by merciless waves toward the rocky shore. The villagers gathered at the cliff's edge, their breath forming white clouds in the frozen morning air, watching as the wreckage groaned and splintered against the stones. From the chaos of broken timber and torn sails, a single figure emerged, gaunt, bleeding, clinging to a piece of driftwood as if it were his last thread of existence. His skin was gray as ash, his hair matted with salt and blood, and in his trembling hands he clutched something dark and wet, a letter, stained crimson, with a name scrawled on the back in shaking letters. Eirik. The name cut through the cold air like a blade through flesh. Runa felt her knees buckle, felt the earth tilt beneath her feet, as if the gods themselves had shifted the world. Her heart stopped, actually stopped, for one terrible, infinite moment. Eirik. The man who had promised to return before the last harvest. The man who had held her face in his calloused hands and sworn on his ancestors' graves that nothing, not storms nor swords nor the rage of the sea itself, would keep him from her. That had been 2 winters ago. 2 winters of waiting, of scanning the horizon until her eyes burned, of waking in the night convinced she heard his voice calling her name across the waves. The villagers fell silent, and even the wind seemed to hold its breath, as if nature itself understood the weight of that single word written in blood. The letter was delivered to Runa by the survivor's trembling fingers, but before she could unfold it, Liv, her older sister, snatched it away. Liv, always cold, always controlled, always hiding what churned beneath that frost-covered surface. Her face betrayed nothing as she broke the wax seal, but Runa saw it, the microscopic tremor in her jaw, the way her pupils dilated just slightly, the barely perceptible catch in her breath. Something was wrong. Something in Liv's reaction didn't fit. The words on the parchment were smeared, damaged by seawater, and what looked disturbingly like blood, but one phrase remained startlingly clear, as if it had been protected by some invisible hand. I promise to return, and I will pay the price. Nobody could tell if it was a farewell or an oath, a goodbye or a warning, a confession or a threat. In that instant, the 2 sisters' eyes met across the survivor's collapsed body, a look heavy with unspoken questions, with love that had curdled into something darker, with fear that tasted like copper on the tongue. Runa saw something flash in Liv's expression, something she'd never seen before: guilt, recognition, terror. It vanished as quickly as it appeared, replaced by that familiar mask of ice, but it had been there, real, undeniable. While the survivor collapsed unconscious at their feet, foam gathering at the corners of his mouth, Runa noticed something that made her blood run cold. Around his neck, partially hidden beneath torn clothing and crusted wounds, hung an iron collar, crude, heavy, the kind used to mark slaves or prisoners. But it was the symbol etched into the metal that stole the breath from her lungs, the same intricate carving that Eirik had spent hours etching into the trunk of an ancient oak tree before he sailed away, his knife working the wood with such careful devotion while she watched from behind, memorizing every line of his back, every movement of his shoulders, knowing she was memorizing something precious that might never return. The symbol was unique, personal, something he'd created just for them, a promise carved in living wood that would outlast their mortal bodies. Time seemed to stop. The waves froze mid-crash. The villagers' whispers turned to static. Runa's mind fractured into 1,000 contradictory thoughts, each one screaming louder than the last. Who was this man? A messenger bearing the worst news imaginable? Or, no, impossible. Could it be Eric himself, transformed by suffering into something unrecognizable? His face was wrong, too thin, too scarred, too broken. But faces could change. Bodies could be reshaped by pain. Yet the collar, the symbol, the letter, the pieces didn't fit together, or they fit too perfectly, in a way that suggested something far more terrible than a simple shipwreck. Liv's hand tightened around the letter, crumpling it slightly. Her knuckles went white. "Get him inside," she commanded, her voice sharp enough to cut through the villagers' growing murmurs. "Now, before the cold takes him too." But her eyes, when they met Runa's again, held a different message entirely. Don't ask, don't question, don't look too closely. The tide rose then, hungry and relentless, reaching up the beach with foaming fingers. The letter slipped from Liv's grasp, or did she drop it deliberately? And the sea claimed it in seconds, dragging it back into the depths as if it had never existed. Several men lunged to retrieve it, but the waves were faster, crueler, swallowing the only written evidence of Eric's fate. But Runa barely noticed the letter's disappearance. She was staring at the unconscious man's face, at the iron collar, at the symbol that meant everything. Her heart hammered against her ribs like a prisoner beating against cell bars, and a terrible certainty was growing in her chest, cold and heavy as a stone. The sea hadn't returned a body. It had returned something far more dangerous. It had returned a secret. The villagers carried the stranger to the sisters' cabin, a small structure that smelled of damp wood, fish oil, and the lingering ghost of their father's pipe smoke. They laid him on the straw mattress near the hearth, where the firelight cast dancing shadows across his ravaged face. Runa wanted to touch him, to trace the scars that mapped his skin like roads to nowhere, but Liv positioned herself between them like a sentinel, her body language screaming warnings that only a sister could read. The cold seeped through the gaps in the wooden walls, mixing with the acrid smell of burning peat and something else. Something wrong, like meat left too long in summer heat. He woke, calling for Liv in a hoarse whisper that sounded like it had been dragged across broken glass, like someone talking in their sleep, reaching for a memory that lived just beyond consciousness. The name hung in the air between them, heavy and accusatory. Runa felt something twist in her chest, not quite pain, not quite jealousy, but a sick combination of both that made her stomach clench. Why Liv's name? Why not hers? She studied him in the firelight, searching for fragments of the man she'd loved, the man who'd promised forever under a sky full of stars. His face was a battlefield of scars, some old and silver, others fresh and angry red, but there was something in the way his eyes moved beneath closed lids, something in the curve of his jaw beneath the damage, that felt achingly, impossibly familiar. Liv, fearing the poison of village gossip that could destroy reputations faster than any blade, presented him to the curious neighbors as a runaway thrall from the southern territories, a man fleeing a cruel master who'd beaten him nearly to death. The lie came easily to her lips, too easily, as if she'd rehearsed it during the long walk from the beach. Runa watched her sister's face as she spun the tale, watched how her eyes never quite met anyone else's, how her fingers twisted in the fabric of her dress. Small tells that most would miss, but Runa had studied Liv's deceptions since childhood. She knew when her sister was hiding something, and this wasn't just a simple protective lie. This was something deeper, something that made Liv's voice catch almost imperceptibly on certain words. Each night, as the wind howled outside and the fire burned low, the stranger would talk in fragments, piecing together a story that never quite formed a complete picture. He spoke of a ship lost in a storm that came from nowhere, of a lord who collected men like other nobles collected hunting dogs, of a love that had been promised, a love that had kept his heart beating when his body wanted to surrender to the cold embrace of death. His words were like shattered pottery. You could see the pieces, recognize their shapes, but couldn't quite reassemble them into something whole. Runa would hide behind the thin wall of woven straw that separated the sleeping area from the main room, her ear pressed against the brittle reeds, tears streaming silently down her face without understanding why his broken stories carved such deep wounds in her chest. Each word felt like it was meant for her, about her, yet spoken to someone else entirely. The doubt grew inside her like a cancer, feeding on every glance between Liv and the stranger, every careful touch as her sister cleaned his wounds, every moment of silence that felt too heavy to be innocent. And with the doubt came jealousy, thick, black, poisonous jealousy that made her hate herself even as she couldn't stop feeling it. Was this Eric? Had he called Liv's name because he'd always loved her instead? Had Runa been the fool, the second choice, the sister selected by duty rather than desire? The questions circled her mind like vultures waiting for something to die. During a particularly violent storm that made the cabin walls shake and the roof thatch lift in places, he asked Liv to help him remember the name of the woman he'd been trying to reach, the woman who'd haunted his dreams during the darkest nights. The request came as thunder cracked overhead, as if the gods themselves were waiting for her answer. Liv's face went pale, then flushed, then pale again. Her mouth opened, closed, opened again, and then she lied. The lie was so smooth, so practiced, that Runa almost believed it herself. "There's no one," Liv said, her voice steady as stone. "You're confused. The fever, the trauma. It's making you remember things that never happened." Runa, crouched behind the wall with her hand pressed over her mouth to muffle any sound, felt something inside her shatter. Her fingers loosened around the clay water pitcher she'd been holding, and it slipped from her grasp. The sound of it hitting the floor was like a thunderclap in the small space, ceramic exploding into a dozen pieces, water spreading across the packed earth floor in a dark stain that looked disturbingly like blood in the firelight. The noise cut through everything. The storm, the crackling fire, the careful lies, the years of unspoken secrets between sisters. Time fractured. The stranger turned toward the sound with a speed that contradicted his supposedly weakened state, his movements sharp and alert, and his eyes, those damaged, scarred eyes, found Runa's through the gap in the straw wall. For one eternal, devastating moment, they stared at each other, and in his gaze, something ignited. Recognition, pure and undeniable. Not confusion, not fever-induced delusion, but the sharp, clear awareness of someone seeing something, someone they'd never forgotten. His pupils dilated, his breath caught audibly, his hand reached out involuntarily, fingers stretching toward her as if pulled by invisible strings. Runa's heart stopped beating, then started again, hammering so hard she thought her ribs might crack. Because she saw it too, she recognized him in that instant, not from his face or his voice or his scars, but from something deeper, something that lived in the way souls recognize each other across any distance, any transformation, any lie. Runa's voice cut through the tension like a blade through silk when she whispered the name that had been burning in her throat. Eric. The single word hung in the air between them, heavy with 2 years of waiting, of grief, of hope that had slowly curdled into something bitter. The man went completely still, as if the name itself had turned him to stone, as if hearing it spoken aloud had physically pierced through whatever armor he'd built around himself. His face drained of what little color it had, his hands began to tremble violently, and for a moment Runa thought he might collapse right there on the floor among the shattered pieces of the water pitcher. He denied it. The denial came fast, too fast, tumbling from his lips in a rush of desperation that felt rehearsed yet genuine all at once. "Finn," he said, his voice cracking on the syllable. "My name is Finn, just Finn, a thrall with no history, no past, no one who matters." But even as the words left his mouth, his body betrayed him. His right hand moved unconsciously to touch the iron collar around his neck, fingers tracing the carved symbol with a familiarity that spoke of muscle memory, of countless times performing this exact gesture. And then tears began to fall. Not the slow, controlled tears of someone crying by choice, but the sudden, unstoppable kind that come from somewhere deeper than consciousness, from a place where lies cannot reach. They streamed down his scarred cheeks without warning, without sound, as if his body was confessing what his mouth refused to admit. Liv watched him with an expression that Runa had never seen on her sister's face before. A mixture of fear, guilt, and something else that looked disturbingly like complicity. Her hands trembled as she gripped the edge of the wooden table, knuckles white, jaw clenched so tight that the muscles in her neck stood out like cords. She was trying to maintain that famous control, that ice-cold composure she wore like armor. But cracks were forming. Runa could see them spreading like fractures in pond ice, could almost hear the sound of something fundamental breaking beneath the surface. The name, Eirik, had reawakened something that Liv had been trying to bury, something that clawed its way up from whatever grave she'd dug for it. Guilt. The word took shape in Runa's mind with absolute certainty. Her sister was drowning in guilt. The days that followed were an excruciating dance of silence and avoidance, of meaningful looks and words left unspoken. Runa tended to the man's wounds with hands that shook, cleaning the infected gashes that crisscrossed his back like some cruel map of suffering, applying the bitter-smelling salves their mother had taught them to make from pine resin and crushed herbs. Each time her fingers touched his skin, she felt electricity. Not the pleasant kind, but the dangerous kind that warned of storms approaching. She searched his scars for memories, for proof, for anything that would confirm or deny what her heart already knew. Meanwhile, Liv tended to the secret with equal care, guarding it like a dragon guards gold, steering conversations away from dangerous territory, intercepting questions from curious villagers who came by with thin excuses about borrowing salt or returning tools. The village hummed with whispers that grew louder each day. Two unmarried sisters sheltering an unknown man. The scandal practically wrote itself. Old women clicked their tongues in disapproval. Young men made crude jokes in the tavern. Children stared with wide eyes and asked questions their parents shushed immediately. The gossip was a living thing, feeding and growing, and Runa could feel it pressing in on them from all sides like walls closing in. At night, the sound of the sea invaded every corner of the cabin, waves crashing with a rhythm that sounded almost like words, like warnings, like accusations. Runa would lie awake on her straw mattress, staring at the ceiling, and see Eric's face as it had been. Young, unmarked, smiling that crooked smile on the beach as he promised to return before the harvest. She'd replay that final morning over and over. The way he'd held her so tight she couldn't breathe, the way his voice had cracked when he swore his oath, the way he'd looked back 3 times as he walked toward the ship. Now that smile was a shadow, distorted by scars and lies and whatever horrors had transformed him into this broken creature who called himself Finn. One morning, while the man slept fitfully in the main room, Liv was changing the straw in his bedding when her hand struck something hard beneath the mattress. She pulled it out slowly, as if it might bite. A leather bracelet, worn and stained, with the oak tree symbol carved into it, the exact same symbol from the iron collar, from the tree in the forest, from the drawings Eric used to scratch into the dirt while they sat together watching the sunset. The bracelet was unmistakable, unique, something no stranger could possess by accident. Liv stood frozen, the bracelet dangling from her fingers like evidence at a trial, and Runa watched from the doorway as the last of her sister's carefully constructed control began to crumble. The truth was cracking through the ice of Liv's lies like spring breaking through winter, and there would be no stopping it now. That evening, Liv confronted him when she thought Runa had gone to fetch water from the well. But Runa had only pretended to leave, had circled back and pressed herself against the outside wall of the cabin, listening through the gaps in the timber. She heard Liv's voice, stripped of its usual authority, trembling with something raw and unguarded. "Who are you really? Why are you here? What do you want from us?" And then came his response. And even through the wall, Runa could hear the devastating honesty in it, could feel the weight of pain that each word carried. "If I tell you who I am," he said, his voice breaking on every syllable, "neither of you will forgive me. Neither of you will understand. Some truths destroy everything they touch." Silence fell like a heavy blanket. Runa held her breath, waiting for more, but instead she heard movement. Footsteps, the door opening. She barely had time to duck around the corner before he emerged from the cabin, moving with surprising strength for someone supposedly recovering from near death. He walked straight into the fog that had rolled in from the sea, thick and white and swallowing, and within seconds he'd vanished completely, as if he'd never existed at all. Runa ran to where he'd disappeared, calling out, but the mist swallowed her voice just as completely as it had swallowed him. When she turned back, Liv was standing in the doorway, tears streaming down her face for the first time in years, and between them lay the truth neither dared to speak aloud. The village woke to rumors that spread faster than fire through dry grass. The stranger had been seen at dawn on the beach, kneeling before the waves like a penitent before an altar, his lips moving in what looked like prayer or confession. Old Bjorn the fisherman swore he'd heard the man weeping, great heaving sobs that competed with the sound of the surf. Young Astrid claimed she'd seen him clutching something to his chest, though she couldn't say what. By the time the stories reached Runa, they'd taken on the quality of folklore, of ghost tales told to frighten children, but the cold dread in her stomach told her they were true. She ran to the beach without bothering to grab her cloak, her bare feet slipping on the frost-covered path, her breath coming in ragged gasps that burned her lungs. The morning air was brutally cold, the kind of cold that felt like knives against exposed skin, but she barely noticed. Her mind was spinning with terrible possibilities, each one worse than the last. Had he walked into the sea? Had he finished what the shipwreck had started? Was she about to find his body floating in the shallows, pale and bloated and beyond all questions? But when she reached the shore, stumbling down the rocky slope with desperation making her clumsy, she found only emptiness. No body. No man. Just the endless gray expanse of water meeting gray sky, and there, driven into the sand like a marker on a grave, the iron collar. It stood upright, half buried, the carved oak symbol facing toward the village, like an accusation. The sight of it stopped her heart. Runa fell to her knees in the wet sand, her dress soaking through immediately, the cold seeping into her bones, but she couldn't move. The collar was a message, but what did it mean? Freedom? Surrender? Goodbye? The sea whispered around it, foam licking at the base, and in that moment, Runa felt something fundamental break inside her. She'd been holding on to hope like a drowning person holds onto driftwood, but now the water was closing over her head and there was nothing left to grasp. A sound escaped her throat, not quite a scream, not quite a sob, something more primal than either. She clawed at the sand around the collar, digging with her bare hands as if she might find answers buried beneath, as if she might unearth the truth along with shells and stones. Her fingers bled. She didn't care. When she finally stumbled back to the cabin, her face was streaked with tears and sand, her hair wild, her hands torn and raw. Liv was waiting by the fire, and the moment their eyes met, something that had been held back for too long finally burst through. "You knew," Runa said, her voice hoarse and broken. "You've known from the beginning." It wasn't a question. Liv's face crumpled, all that careful control dissolving like salt in water, and suddenly she looked older, exhausted, as if she'd been carrying an impossible weight for far too long. The confession came in pieces, jagged and painful, each word seeming to cost Liv something vital. Years ago, before Eric had ever spoken to Runa, before their father had arranged the betrothal, Liv and Eric had fallen in love. It had been secret, desperate, the kind of love that burns too hot to sustain. They'd met in hidden places, the oak grove, the caves along the coast, the ruins of the old watchtower. They'd made promises written in breath and touch, promises they'd believed would last forever, but their father had other plans. He'd chosen Runa for Eric, the younger daughter, more gentle, more compliant, better suited to be a good wife. The decision had been practical, political even. Liv was too strong-willed, too likely to challenge her husband. "It was an arrangement," Liv said, her voice cracking like ice. "Not love. It was never supposed to be love." But Runa heard the lie beneath the words, heard what Liv wasn't saying, that Eric had accepted the arrangement, had made his promises to Runa and kept them, or tried to, that he'd chosen duty over desire, obligation over passion. The betrayal cut deeper than any blade. Runa felt it in layers, betrayed by her sister, by Eirik, by her father, by fate itself. She'd built her whole life around waiting for a man who'd belonged to someone else first, who'd maybe never stopped belonging to Liv despite all his oaths and promises. "You let me wait for him," Runa whispered. and the accusation in those 6 words was devastating. You watched me wait, watched me hope, and you said nothing. Liv tried to reach for her, but Runa jerked away as if her sister's touch might burn. The space between them felt infinite, unbridgeable, filled with years of deception and words left unspoken. The fire crackled in the hearth, indifferent to their pain, casting dancing shadows that made the cabin feel haunted. Outside, the wind picked up, howling around the corners of the building like something alive and angry. That night, neither sister slept. They existed in separate corners of the small space, each wrapped in their own private misery, the silence between them heavier than any words could be. When dawn finally came, gray and reluctant, Runa rose to find something impossible. The iron collar, the same one she'd left buried in the beach sand, was hanging from a nail beside the door. It hadn't been there when they'd gone to bed. Someone had retrieved it, cleaned it, and placed it there while they slept, or pretended to sleep. And fastened to it with careful precision was a single braid of hair, intricately woven, the color unmistakable even in the dim morning light. Her hair, her exact shade, her exact texture. But Runa had cut no hair, had woven no braid. The impossibility of it made her skin crawl. She reached out with trembling fingers to touch it, to confirm it was real and not some fever dream born of grief and exhaustion. The braid was real, solid, undeniable. A message from beyond the possible, a sign that transcended rational explanation. Her mind spun, trying to make sense of what couldn't make sense, trying to find logic in something that defied logic. Who had done this? How? Why? The questions multiplied like breeding rabbits, each one spawning 3 more, until her thoughts were nothing but chaos and confusion and growing terror. From outside came the sound of footsteps, heavy and deliberate, crunching through the frost-hardened snow that had fallen during the night. Not the light steps of a villager passing by, but purposeful steps heading directly for their door, coming closer, closer still, and then, cutting through the gray dawn light, through the whistling wind, through the pounding of blood in Runa's ears, came a voice, male, rough, achingly, impossibly familiar, speaking a single word that shattered what remained of her world. Runa? He stood in the doorway like an apparition, backlit by the pale morning sun, and for a moment Runa couldn't breathe, couldn't think, couldn't do anything but stare. He had returned, but everything about him was different, fundamentally, devastatingly different. The eyes that had once held such warmth, such gentle promises whispered under starlight, now carried the hardness of someone who'd learned that survival requires cruelty, that the world breaks soft things without mercy. His jaw was set in a way she didn't recognize. His shoulders carried tension like armor, and when he looked at her, there was something guarded in his gaze, something that assessed and calculated before it felt. This was not the man who'd left. This was what remained after that man had been destroyed and rebuilt from broken pieces. He spoke slowly, each word chosen with care, as if language itself had become a minefield he had to navigate. He claimed to have recovered fragments of his memory, scattered pieces that didn't quite form a complete picture, images and sensations that floated up from the darkness like bodies from a shipwreck. But the name, his name, remained lost, trapped behind some barrier his mind had constructed to protect itself. "I don't know who I am," he said, and the raw honesty in his voice was more painful than any lie could have been. "I only know what I feel when I look at you, and it's tearing me apart." Runa's first instinct was to run to him, to throw her arms around him and sob into his chest until all the grief and waiting and fear poured out of her. She actually took a step forward, her body moving before her mind could intervene. But Liv's hand shot out and grabbed her wrist with bruising force, nails digging into skin, holding her back. "Don't," Liv hissed, and there was something fierce and protective in that single syllable, but also something darker, possessiveness perhaps, or jealousy that had fermented into something toxic. Runa jerked away, fury flooding through her veins like poison. But the moment had passed. The man had seen the exchange, had witnessed the conflict between them, and his expression shuttered closed like a door slamming shut. The silence that followed was excruciating, thick with everything unsaid, everything that couldn't be said. Between the two sisters stood this broken man who wore Eric's scars and spoke with something like Eric's voice and looked at Runa with eyes that knew her in ways no stranger could. Their love, if that's what this twisted, painful thing still was, had taken physical form, but it was a form without truth, without certainty, without any foundation to build on. They were three people trapped in a nightmare where the rules kept changing, where facts were fluid and identity was negotiable and nothing could be trusted, not even memory itself. He began to speak again, his voice low and rough like stones grinding together, telling them a story that made Runa's blood run cold. After the shipwreck, or what he believed was a shipwreck, though even that memory was hazy and unreliable, he'd been pulled from the water by men who saw not a person, but an opportunity. They'd sold him to a count from the Eastern Territories, a man known for his cruelty and his collection of broken things. Slaves, criminals, defeated warriors, the count gathered them all, stripped them of their names and pasts, and molded them into whatever shape served his purposes. The iron collar had been a symbol of that ownership, a brand that marked him as property rather than human. He'd spent months, maybe longer, time became meaningless in that place, as someone else's possession, doing things he couldn't bring himself to describe, surviving in ways that carved pieces out of his soul. But here was the detail that made both sisters go rigid with shock. Someone from their own village had betrayed him. Someone who'd known about his departure, who'd known his route, who'd sent word to raiders waiting in ambush. The information had been sold for coin or favor, or perhaps something even more valuable, the removal of an inconvenient person from an inconvenient situation. It was deliberate, he said, his eyes moving between them with an intensity that felt like accusation. Someone wanted me gone. Someone made sure I wouldn't return. The words hung in the air like an axe waiting to fall. Runa felt the floor tilt beneath her feet, felt reality rearranging itself into new and terrible patterns. Years ago, only a handful of people had known the exact day of Eric's departure, the specific ship he'd be taking, the route they'd planned. Her father, now dead, a few trusted friends, and Liv. Always Liv, who'd been there for every whispered conversation, every secret plan, who'd helped Runa pack the provisions for Eric's journey while wearing that same mask of calm control she always wore. The suspicion formed in Runa's mind like ice crystals, sharp and cold and undeniable. She turned to look at her sister, really look at her, and saw guilt written in every line of Liv's body, in the way she couldn't meet anyone's eyes, in the trembling of her hands, in the slight hunch of her shoulders as if bracing for a blow. Runa couldn't stay in that cabin another second. The walls were closing in, the air too thick to breathe, her mind screaming with questions she was terrified to ask. She ran, bursting through the door and into the forest, branches tearing at her dress and hair as she plunged deeper into the trees, running until her lungs burned and her legs threatened to give out. She collapsed finally against the trunk of the old oak, the one with Eric's symbol carved into it, now weathered and filled with moss but still visible, still there, still proof that something had once been real and true and promised. She pressed her forehead against the rough bark and let herself break. Let the sobs tear through her with a violence that felt like dying. When she finally returned to the cabin hours later, face swollen and eyes burning, she found Liv alone. The man had gone, vanished again like smoke. Liv sat by the cold hearth, no fire burning, no warmth, just ashes and emptiness, with the iron collar cradled in her lap like a child. Tears streaked her face, but she didn't wipe them away, didn't try to hide them. She looked up when Runa entered, and her eyes were wells of misery and regret. "I did what I had to do to protect you," Liv whispered, her voice barely audible, each word dropping like stones into still water. "You have to believe me. Everything I did was to keep you safe." But safe from what? Safe from love? Safe from happiness? Safe from choices? Runa wanted to scream the questions, wanted to shake her sister until the truth fell out, but she was too exhausted, too hollowed out by grief to do anything but stand there and stare. The confession hung between them, neither complete admission nor convincing denial, just enough truth to poison what remained of their relationship without offering the relief of full disclosure. The next morning, when gray dawn light filtered through the shutters, Runa discovered that both the collar and the man had disappeared, gone as if they'd never existed, leaving behind only questions and the ghost of a presence that lingered in the cabin like smoke after a fire has died. The search swept across the coastline like a fever, villagers combing every inch of beach, every rock formation, every cave where a man might hide or a body might wash ashore. They found nothing but traces, footprints that led to the jagged rocks at the northern point, and then simply vanished, as if he'd sprouted wings or been claimed by the sea itself. No blood, no torn clothing, no signs of struggle. Just prints in the sand that ended where the world ended, where stone met sky and logic gave way to impossibility. The fishermen shook their heads and muttered about spirits and curses, about men who belonged more to the ocean than to land, about debts paid in ways mortals couldn't understand. Runa felt her grip on reality beginning to slip, felt the edges of her sanity fraying like old rope. The nights were worst, especially when the moon was full and bright, turning the sea into liquid silver. She would wake from dreams she couldn't quite remember, her heart pounding, absolutely certain she'd heard Eric's voice calling her name across the waves. Not imagined, real, clear, desperate. She'd run to the beach in her nightdress, bare feet bleeding on sharp stones, and stand at the water's edge listening, straining to hear it again, that voice that lived somewhere between memory and madness. The villagers began to whisper about her too, adding her name to the growing collection of strange occurrences and inexplicable events that had plagued them since that first ship had returned. Liv tried to contain her sister's unraveling, tried to pull her back from whatever precipice she was approaching, but Liv's own mind was fracturing under the weight of guilt that grew heavier with each passing day. She'd stopped eating, stopped sleeping properly. Dark circles bloomed under her eyes like bruises, and her hands developed a constant tremor that she couldn't hide. At night, Runa would hear her sister weeping behind the thin partition that separated their sleeping areas. Great shuddering sobs that sounded like they were being torn from somewhere deep and vital. But in the morning, Liv's face would be composed again, that mask firmly in place, as if the nighttime breakdown had never happened. The pretense was exhausting to maintain, and even more exhausting to witness. Then came the traveler, a merchant from the southern territories who'd stopped in their village to trade furs and amber. He brought news that made Runa's blood freeze in her veins. A man matching their stranger's description had been spotted at Count Magnus's fortress, 3 days' journey inland. The man had been seen in the great hall during a feast, dressed not in slave rags but in fine clothing, speaking with the count as if they were equals, or perhaps something more complex. Debtor and creditor, perhaps, or player and pawn in some game whose rules remained hidden. The merchant couldn't say for certain it was the same man. The scars made identification difficult, and he'd been too far away to see clearly. But the timing, the general appearance, the air of tragedy that clung to him like a shroud, it all matched too well to be coincidence. Liv's reaction confirmed everything Runa had been afraid to believe. Her sister's face went chalk white, then gray, and for a moment Runa thought she might actually faint. But Liv steadied herself against the table, fingers digging into the wood until her knuckles went bloodless, and made a decision that was written clearly across her features, even before she spoke it aloud. That night, while Runa pretended to sleep, Liv packed a small bag with provisions, dressed in her warmest cloak, and left a note weighted down with a smooth stone on the table. The message was brief, written in Liv's careful hand that had taught Runa her letters years ago. "If I don't return, you'll know the truth. Some debts can only be paid in person. Forgive me for what I've done and for what I'm about to do." Runa found the note at dawn, her fingers trembling as she traced the words. The finality in them terrified her more than anything that had come before. This wasn't just a journey to find answers. This was a goodbye, a settling of accounts, possibly a sacrifice. For 3 days and nights, Runa tried to convince herself to stay, to let Liv face whatever consequences awaited her alone, to finally let her sister bear the burden of her own choices. But on the 4th morning, as snow began to fall in thick, heavy flakes that transformed the world into something unfamiliar and treacherous, Runa couldn't stand it anymore. Whatever truth waited at that fortress, whatever horror or revelation or final tragedy, she needed to witness it. She needed to understand. Even if understanding destroyed her, it would be better than this half-life of uncertainty and slowly accumulating madness. The journey was brutal. Winter had arrived early and with unusual violence, as if nature itself was trying to prevent her from reaching her destination. Snow piled in drifts that came up to her thighs, wind cut through her cloak like it was made of cobwebs, and more than once she lost the path entirely and had to backtrack or guess based on the position of landmarks she could barely see through the white curtain of falling snow. Her fingers and toes went numb, then painful, then numb again in a way that frightened her. She ate the last of her food on the second day and survived the third on melted snow and determination alone. Several times she considered turning back, but the thought of Liv facing whatever waited ahead without her, or worse, never returning at all, drove her forward through exhaustion and cold that felt like dying by degrees. When she finally crested the last hill and saw the Count's fortress sprawled across the valley below, her legs nearly gave out. The castle was massive, all dark stone and sharp angles, with towers that clawed at the gray sky like fingers. Smoke rose from multiple chimneys, and torches burned in brackets along the walls despite the daylight, giving the whole structure an ominous, almost hellish appearance. The main gates stood open, not welcoming but careless, as if the Count feared no threat worth closing his doors against. Runa stumbled down the hill and through those gates, barely registering the surprised looks of the guards, moving with the single-minded determination of someone far past fear or rational thought. The great hall was easy to find. Just follow the sound of voices, the smell of roasted meat and wood smoke. She pushed through the heavy doors, and the warmth hit her like a physical blow after days of brutal cold. The hall fell silent as everyone turned to stare at this wild-eyed, half-frozen woman who'd appeared like an apparition. And there, in the center of the hall, kneeling on the stone floor with her hands clasped in front of her, was Liv. And standing before her, looking down with an expression Runa couldn't read from this distance, was the man. And at the head of the hall, seated in a carved chair that might as well have been a throne, watching the scene with the detached interest of someone observing a play, was presumably Count Magnus himself. The tableau was frozen, perfect, terrible. Liv's face was streaked with tears, her lips were moving. Confession, plea, prayer, impossible to tell. The man's hands were clenched at his sides, his entire body rigid with barely controlled emotion. And hanging in the air between all of them was something so heavy, so charged with consequence, that Runa could feel it pressing against her skin like atmospheric pressure before a storm. Liv's head turned at the sound of the doors, and her eyes met Runa's across the expanse of that grand hall. What Runa saw in her sister's gaze made her heart stop. Resignation, terrible love, and the clear knowledge that everything was about to shatter beyond any possibility of repair. Liv's mouth formed words that carried across the silence with devastating clarity. "Forgive me, sister. The man we both loved is the same man, but he is not who he claims to be." The man stepped forward, and in that moment the last mask fell away, crumbling like dried clay, revealing what had been hidden beneath layers of deception and self-protection and calculated performance. His voice, when he finally spoke, carried none of the hesitation or confusion that had colored it before. This was clear, certain, the voice of someone who'd made a decision to stop running from truth, no matter how much it cost. "My name is Eric," he said, and the words landed like stones in still water, sending ripples through everything. "I remember everything. I've remembered everything since the moment I woke in your cabin and saw your faces. Every promise, every touch, every word spoken under stars or whispered in darkness. I remember it all, and I've been lying since the beginning." The confession hung in the air, and Runa felt something inside her chest crack open, not breaking exactly, but splitting like ice under pressure, revealing the dark water underneath. He'd known. From the very first moment, from that first night when he'd supposedly been delirious and confused, he'd known exactly who he was and who they were, and what he'd lost and what he'd left behind. The betrayal of it was almost physical, a punch to the gut that left her gasping. But he wasn't finished. There was more, and from the look on his face, the worst was yet to come. I pretended to have lost my memory because I needed to understand something that had haunted me through every moment of captivity, through every degradation and beating and night when I prayed for death, he continued, his eyes moving between the two sisters with an intensity that felt like being flayed alive. I needed to know if what you felt for me, either of you, was real. If you loved the man I was, or just the promise I represented, the security, the future, the idea of being chosen. His jaw clenched and tears began to track down his scarred face, but his voice remained steady, relentless. I wanted to know who would love me when I was nothing, when I was just a broken stranger with no name, no past, no value. Would you care for me then? Would you fight for me? Or would the love evaporate when the pretty packaging was stripped away? The cruelty of it took Runa's breath away. He'd orchestrated their suffering, had watched them tear themselves apart over him, had let them doubt and grieve and slowly go mad, all to satisfy some twisted need to test their devotion. She wanted to hate him. Every fiber of her being reached for that clean, simple emotion. Hatred, pure and justified. But she couldn't quite grasp it, couldn't make it stick, because underneath the anger was something more complicated, understanding. Because hadn't she wondered the same thing? When he'd been gone, when years had passed with no word, hadn't she questioned whether her love was for Eric the man or Eric the dream? Whether she'd been in love with a person or with the story she'd told herself about what her life would become? Liv's sobs were the only sound in the hall, great heaving cries that seemed to come from the very bottom of her soul. She'd collapsed fully to the floor now, forehead pressed against the cold stone, her entire body shaking. When she finally managed to speak, her words came out broken, barely coherent. "I betrayed you," she gasped between sobs. "I sent word of your departure. I told them which ship, which route, when you'd be most vulnerable. I thought, God forgive me, I thought if you were gone, captured or killed or just vanished, that the promise would die with you, that Runa would be free." That I would be free. She lifted her face, and the anguish written there was so raw that even Count Magnus, watching from his throne-like chair with the detached amusement of someone enjoying a particularly good theatrical performance, seemed to shift uncomfortably. "I convinced myself I was protecting her," Liv continued, her voice gaining strength even as it remained thick with tears. "Protecting her from a marriage she'd never chosen, from a life decided by our father's will rather than her own heart. But I was lying to myself. The truth I've been too much of a coward to admit, is that I wanted you gone because I couldn't bear watching you build a life with her. Couldn't bear seeing you touch her the way you'd touched me, hearing you make promises to her when you'd made the same promises to me first. I chose to destroy us all rather than live with that pain." Her eyes found Runa's across the distance. "I destroyed your chance at happiness to ease my own jealousy. I'm not your protector. I'm your betrayer." The silence that followed was absolute, so complete that Runa could hear her own heartbeat thundering in her ears, could hear the crackle of the fire in the massive hearth, could hear the breathing of every person in that hall. She looked at Liv, her sister, her constant companion, the person who'd taught her to read and helped her through childhood illnesses and braided her hair before her betrothal ceremony. She looked at Eric, the man she'd waited years for, the man who'd tested her love like it was something that needed proving, the man whose return had brought only more pain than his absence ever had. And she felt something inside her shift, rearrange, settle into a new configuration that felt both devastating and strangely liberating. "You're both asking me to choose," Runa heard herself say, her voice sounding distant even to her own ears, as if someone else was speaking through her mouth. "To forgive one of you, to condemn the other, to say whose betrayal was worse, whose love was more real, whose suffering matters most." She took a step forward, then another, her legs steadier than she would have expected. "But I can't, I won't. Because I finally understand something that you both seem to have forgotten. This was never about love at all. It was about ownership, about two people who wanted to possess me, one through marriage, one through sacrifice, and a man who wanted to possess my devotion on his terms, when it suited him, in whatever form fed his wounded pride." She reached down and picked up the iron collar, which someone had placed on a table near where Liv knelt. The metal was cold in her hands, heavy, the carved oak symbol that had once meant promise now meaning only pain. She held it up, turned it so the firelight caught the markings. "You carved this symbol to bind me to you," she said to Eric. "And you," turning to Liv, "you tried to erase that binding by erasing him. But neither of you ever asked what I wanted, what I dreamed, who I loved, if I loved anyone at all beyond the stories I'd been told about what my life should be." Eric moved toward her, hand outstretched, his face a mask of regret and pleading. "Runa, please, let me explain." But she stepped back, shaking her head. The tears came then, hot and fast, but her voice remained steady. "You wanted to know who loved the real you," she said. "The broken, scarred, nameless version. Well, here's your answer. I cared for a wounded stranger because that's who I am. I would have done the same for anyone. But love, real love, that requires truth, and you gave me nothing but tests and lies." She walked to where Liv still knelt and placed the collar in her sister's trembling hands. "And you," she said softly. "You thought destroying him would free me, but you only built a different cage, one made of secrets and guilt instead of iron." The sob that escaped Runa then was raw, torn from somewhere deep. "I loved you both. But the love you're offering now, built on betrayal and tests and conditional forgiveness, that's not love. That's just another form of suffering, wearing love's face." The silence stretched, broken only by the popping of logs in the fire. Count Magnus finally spoke, his voice carrying dark amusement. "Well, this is better than any tale the Scalds could compose." But no one acknowledged him. The three of them existed in their own world of shattered promises and impossible choices, and even the Count's cruel entertainment couldn't penetrate that bubble of grief. Eric sank to his knees beside Liv, and in that moment they looked like what they truly were. Two broken people whose love had curdled into poison, whose best intentions had paved a road straight to devastation. "Now you understand the price of your promise," Runa whispered, placing the collar back in Eric's hands, feeling the weight of it transfer, feeling herself becoming lighter even as her heart shattered. "It cost us everything." The morning came with unusual gentleness, as if the world itself had decided to offer mercy after so much cruelty. The village woke to news that had traveled faster than seemed possible. Eric's ship had departed before dawn, carrying him back to whatever life awaited beyond the horizon. Some said he'd left alone, a solitary figure standing at the prow as the vessel pushed away from shore. Others claimed they'd seen Count Magnus's men escorting him, settling some debt or obligation that remained mysterious to common folk. But everyone agreed on one thing. He was gone, and this time there would be no returning, no dramatic reappearance, no more tests or trials or broken promises washing up with the tide. The two sisters stood on the beach where everything had begun, watching the fog swallow the last visible piece of the mast. The ship had been nothing but a dark smudge against gray sky for several minutes now, more memory than reality, and soon even that would be consumed by the mist that rolled in from the sea like a living thing. They stood apart, not far, perhaps 3 or 4 feet of sand between them, but the distance felt vast, unbridgeable, a chasm carved by betrayal and jealousy and love that had twisted into something unrecognizable. Yet they were both here, both bearing witness to this final departure, and that meant something. What exactly, neither could yet say. Runa found she couldn't cry anymore. She'd emptied herself of tears over the past weeks, had wrung every drop of grief from her body until nothing remained but a strange, hollow peace. The numbness should have frightened her, but instead it felt like a gift, like the mercy of shock that lets the body survive wounds that would otherwise prove fatal. She'd loved Eric once, or thought she had, or been told she should. The distinctions had become too blurred to parse. But watching his ship disappear felt less like losing something precious, and more like setting down a burden she'd been carrying so long she'd forgotten it wasn't part of her body. The relief was dizzying. Liv hadn't spoken since they'd left the Count's fortress 3 days ago. The journey back had been silent except for the crunch of snow under their boots, the whistle of wind through bare branches, the occasional grunt of effort as they'd pushed through drifts that seemed determined to bury them. They'd shared body heat at night without discussion, huddled together for survival rather than comfort, and in the morning they'd separated again without acknowledging what had passed in darkness. But now, as the last trace of the ship vanished, Liv finally broke her silence. "I don't expect forgiveness," she said, her voice rough from disuse and unshed tears. "I don't deserve it. But I need you to know, everything I did, every terrible choice, it came from loving you. Twisted, broken, poisonous love. But love nonetheless." Runa didn't respond immediately. She bent down and picked up a smooth stone, weighed it in her palm, then threw it into the surf with more force than necessary. It disappeared without a trace, swallowed by waves that cared nothing for human drama or heartbreak. "Love shouldn't destroy," she finally said. "Real love shouldn't require sacrifice and suffering and the death of dreams. If that's what love is, then maybe we never understood it at all. Maybe we were just children playing at adult emotions, using words we didn't comprehend for feelings we'd been taught to have." They turned away from the water together, an unconscious synchronization that spoke of years spent as sisters, of shared rhythms deeper than conscious thought. The walk back to the village felt longer than it should have, each step heavy with awareness that they were returning to a life that would never be the same, that couldn't be the same. The cabin would still smell of fish oil and wood smoke. The fire would still need tending. The daily tasks would continue with their familiar rhythms, but everything had been fundamentally altered. They were different people now, carrying knowledge that changed the flavor of every memory, that cast shadows over moments they'd once held as precious and pure. When they reached the cabin, Runa found something waiting on the table that made her breath catch. The original letter, the one the sea had supposedly claimed on that first terrible day. It sat there as if it had never left, as if the intervening weeks had been a fever dream, the parchment dried and intact, impossible but undeniable. With trembling hands that betrayed emotions she thought she'd mastered, she unfolded it and read the words written in Eric's careful script. Words she'd only glimpsed that first time before Liv had taken it away and the ocean had claimed it. "The sea returns what is pure," it read. "If I will return, I do not know. The future is written in water and wind, always changing, never certain. But if love survives, true love, not the kind built on promises made by others or obligations accepted without choice, then it will find a way to unite us again. Not as we were, perhaps, not in the way we imagined, but in whatever form serves the truth we were too afraid to speak." The tears came then, silent and cleansing, streaming down Runa's face as she read and reread those words. He'd known. Even before he left, he'd known that the foundation was cracked, that they were building their future on sand that would shift with the first strong wave. The letter wasn't a promise, it was a release. Permission to let go, to find whatever truth lived beyond the stories they'd been told about what their lives should be. She passed it to Liv, who read it with her own tears falling, and for the first time since the Count's fortress, something passed between them that felt like the beginning of understanding. Not forgiveness, not yet, maybe not ever in the way the word was traditionally meant, but recognition, acknowledgement, the first tentative step toward something that might eventually resemble peace. As evening approached and the sun began its descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose that seemed too beautiful for a day that had held so much grief, the wind carried a sound that might have been laughter, light, distant, impossible to locate. The sea, perhaps, or memory playing tricks on ears that had heard too much pain. Runa and Liv stood in the doorway of their cabin, and without planning it, without discussing it, they reached for each other. Their hands met and clasped, fingers intertwining with a tentative pressure that asked permission even as it sought comfort. The embrace that followed was careful, fragile. Two people who damaged each other terribly trying to remember how to offer gentleness instead of wounds. He didn't win. Runa whispered against her sister's hair, breathing in the familiar scent of wood smoke and the herbal soap they made together each spring. And he didn't lose. He just left. And we're still here. Liv's arms tightened around her, and the sob that escaped her was painful but clean, like lancing an infected wound. "We're still here," she repeated, Despite everything we did to each other, despite all the ways we broke what we were supposed to protect, we survived. The word hung between them. Survived, not conquered, not won, not achieved some triumphant victory over adversity, just survived. And somehow that felt more honest than any grand proclamation could have been. They'd survived their father's death, the long years of Eric's absence, the shipwreck that had returned him transformed, the betrayals and lies and terrible choices made from love twisted into possession. They'd survived each other. That had to count for something. That had to be enough to build on, even if the structure would look nothing like what they'd imagined in their younger, more innocent days. As full darkness fell and they moved back inside to light the fire and prepare a simple meal, neither particularly wanted but both knew they needed, Runa felt something settling inside her chest. Not happiness, not peace exactly, but something more valuable. Release. The weight of the promise, the burden of waiting, the obligation to love in the shape prescribed by others, all of it was floating away like ashes on the wind. What remained was raw and uncertain, painful in its newness, but it was real in a way nothing had been real for a very long time. Love hadn't won, because love, the kind they'd been taught to pursue, the kind built on promises and arrangements and pretty lies, had never been the point. But something had survived. Something more fundamental than romantic love, more durable than passion, more essential than the stories poets told. In the echo of the sea, in the crackle of their fire, in the careful space they maintained while learning to exist together again, there was something stronger than blood, more lasting than promises carved in oak trees. There was forgiveness beginning to take root in poisoned soil. There was understanding that pain shared becomes pain halved. There was the knowledge that they'd both been drowning and had somehow found their way back to shore. And that, Runa thought as she watched her sister's profile in the firelight, would have to be enough. Sometimes the greatest act of love is not holding on, but letting go. Runa and Liv learned that promises made in our name, without our voice, become prisons disguised as devotion. They discovered that jealousy dressed as protection destroys just as thoroughly as hatred, and that testing love reveals not its strength, but our own insecurity. In the end, what saved them wasn't romantic love or grand gestures or perfect forgiveness. It was the brutal honesty of acknowledging that they'd all been wrong, that they'd all caused pain, and that survival sometimes means building something new from the ashes of what we thought we wanted. What would you have done in Runa's place? Could you forgive a sister who betrayed you while claiming to protect you? Would you accept a love that needed to test you before it could trust you? And if you were Liv, carrying the weight of a choice made from jealousy and regret, could you live with yourself knowing you'd destroyed the happiness of the person you loved most? These are questions without easy answers, reflections that linger long after the story ends. Because the truth is, we're all capable of both great love and terrible choices, and sometimes they're the same thing wearing different faces. If this story moved you, if it made you question what love really means and what forgiveness truly costs, then share it with someone who needs to hear it. Leave a like to help others find this tale of sisters, secrets, and the courage it takes to choose truth over comfortable lies. And subscribe, because every story we tell here is a mirror held up to the human heart, and sometimes the reflection is exactly what we need to see.